Good afternoon. I am sitting again with His Eminence Archbishop Lazar Puhalo, who is the founder and the abbot of the All Saints Monastery here in British Columbia. Your Eminence, the Bible story about the death of Jesus goes like this. The Jewish authorities brought charges against Jesus to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, who then had him executed on the cross. And some have argued that the Jews, not as individuals, but as a people, through their highest representative, the highest authority, had therefore a driving role into the death of Jesus. But you told me earlier that there is more to the story in the sense that, yes, while it's the high priest, the ultimate authority, who pressed the charges against Jesus, he nonetheless was not the sole religious leader at the time, and others who might not have been the high priest but carried a religious way disagreed. The other religious leaders, they disagreed. Plus, that motivation from the high priest was not necessarily purely on religious ground, but maybe also on material greed, for material greed
Yes.
reason.
Yes.
What's your view on this?
Well, in the first place, I don't see why anyone would think that because the highest religious authorities of the nation said that blood be on us and it on our children, then taking that to refer to the entire Jewish nation just because some leaders said it and probably encouraged other people to say it just on their because they had such prestige. But that doesn't really compute because we don't believe in original sin, the doctrine of original sin. No one can inherit the guilt of anyone else. And you can't pass guilt on genetically. So there's something else going on here that we have to stop and think about. In the first place, you know, usually the high priest was a Sadducee because the Romans trusted the Sadducees better, or sometimes Pharisee, but very often the high priesthood was attained by bribery to the Roman officials. And in the case of Caiaphas and his family, Caiaphas and his family were running the temples a little bit like a criminal enterprise. They're sort of their own family piggy bank. There are 6 members of the Caiaphas family have been high priests in a row. I think one was the son-in-law, and the other was an affiliate. But anyway, there are 6 or 7 high priests in a row that were the Caiaphas clan somehow, and they were misusing the temple treasury. They built very beautiful palace that Caiaphas had built for himself. We find the ground of the ruins of it, and very elaborate. And so he had an extra income from somewhere. Now the fact that they would stand in the praetorium or wherever they were and shout, "His blood be on us and our children," that, first of all, they likely wouldn't have said that. And secondly, how would the Jewish peasants in Galilee be responsible for the blood shed by the high priest's family? Caiaphas wasn't high priest at the time. He'd been high priest and his family had been. But there's no way that they could. First of all, the highest authority for Israel was Yahweh, was God. So the high priest couldn't inflict guilt on anyone under any circumstances. They didn't. That would be magical, have some kind of special magical powers. Unfortunately, that was taken and read literally and then expanded, not just to say that the children of those who were standing in the praetorium shouting "Crucify him," but for the entire Jewish nation. And that's completely irrational. Some of them didn't even live in Palestine at the time. They lived as far away as Spain. Some evidently some Jews were exporting tin from Britain already. They had trading posts along the Black Sea. So how could you possibly imagine that scoundrels like Caiaphas and his bunch could bring down the guilt of the blood of Christ on the entire Jewish nation forever, each generation of the entire Jewish nation? That's completely irrational. But it was taken that way and made almost a doctrine of the church. And I think it was an actual doctrine in the Latin church, but certainly infected the Orthodox Church as well for generations. And in the first place, not all of the leaders of the Jewish nation were so anxious about this. Nicodemus was a Jewish noble, I guess you call him, and Joseph of Arimathea, and even Heidel's grandson, Gamaliel, was had protested condemning Christ without a fair trial, without a fair hearing. So it's not as if everyone was all in favor of crucifying him, but once Christ had interfered with the mercantile enterprises in the temple, then of course the Caiaphas clan, who were profiting from all that, were really set on his destruction. Well, we understand now. I have some research that some scholars have done, and I would consider it anecdotal because I don't know how thorough the research was, but that even the money changers and sellers of sacrificial animals in the temple it was necessary to have the money changers because people came from all over the world for Passover and they needed the local currency. But if some of the researchers are correct, then people would bribe the temple authorities for the spot that they got to conduct business on, the most advantageous spots for it. So there was some chicanery and financial shenanigans going on with the high priestly authorities, particularly evidently the clan of Caiaphas. And we have it from some later writings that Caiaphas' family was in sort of a little mafia of some kind. But the very idea that they could call down guilt on all the Jewish nation, call down guilt on all generations of the Judean nation is completely ludicrous theologically and reasonably, because we're not guilty even of Adam's sin, as the doctrine of original sin would teach. We all inherit his guilt genetically, I suppose, but we didn't. We inherited only alienation from God. We didn't inherit Adam's guilt. The result of his actions, children born after him and born after Adam and Eve were raised by Adam and Eve, and they still maintain this alienation from God, which is why Jesus Christ was incarnate, the perfectly divine nature, assuming the perfect human nature, taking away that alienation between the divine and the human is part of redemption itself. But this horrible, tragic notion that every generation of Jews were guilty of the blood of Christ is completely ludicrous. In the beginning, there was no reason to accept that, except the first of all, fundamentalism, I guess, reading every word of the scriptures if it was literal and meaningful. But even if you read that literally, you say, wait a minute, what right did the leaders of the Jews have to bring down blood guilt upon the entire nation of Jews and every generation of the nation of Jews? Only God could have visited something like that on people, because only he would have had the power and authority. But we understand God's nature in a completely different way. So let's put aside that idea of all Jews having blood guilt for Christ. The Romans crucified Christ. They had charges against Christ, maybe filed by the high priest, I suppose. But anyway, he was convicted on those charges and crucified. And we have to understand now, if we're believers and we understand our theology, the crucifixion of Christ was by his own will. He gave himself for the life of the world. So that was the crucifixion was inevitable because that's what was in the will of Christ himself. And we need to hold people account for their own sins, not for some imaginary curse brought down on them. You know, we say genocide in Gaza, okay, that's the Jews who are participating in that genocide today. But the idea that every generation and all Jews were guilty of the blood of Christ is just absolutely ludicrous.
Understood. However, at the time of the death of Jesus, what do you make of the observation that it is the Jews as an institutionalized group of population through their highest authority who are the driving role into? So it might not be the individual Jews and the Jews in later generation that played that were responsible, but at the time, Judaism and Jews as an institutionalized religion, which was also a social institution back then, had the driving role by pressing for the death of Jesus.
You know, if the blood guilt had been passed on to all Jews in every generation, there would be something magical. It would be like one of the curses put in the pyramids. You can't curse the whole nation and all the people for the actions of a few. I mean, Jews in Galilee probably had no idea that what was going on in Jerusalem at that time. And certainly the Jews beyond the sea, the Otomer Jews, didn't have no idea what was going on in Jerusalem. Without their consent, you know, it's just ludicrous to say that all Jews everywhere at all times consented in the crucifixion of Jesus.
Right, so it's not so much the collective responsibility, but the historical accuracy of the responsibility of the Jews as a group of population, under the argument that it was their position was voiced through their highest authority, through their highest representative.
Well, who's to say that all the Jews were giving voice to the highest authorities? I mean, a lot of the Jews despised the Caiaphas clan.
Sure, it was not...
only the ones gathered there before Pilate who were inspired by the high priests and that clan to call for the death of Jesus. Mm-hmm. They're the only ones who have any guilt at all. Mm-hmm. Nobody else could have a guilt for it.
True, it was not a Swiss democracy with voting by raising your hand, but can one say that it was the closest approximation to what Judaism thought and was at the time? Maybe not Jews as individuals, but as the theology of the religious leadership of the time position on Jesus, and therefore...
Well, I mean, enough of the Jews accepted Christ and his teachings in the first place. So that would make, if all the Jews were going to be guilty of the crucifixion of Christ, that would include the apostles and any children they might have because they were Jews. So, you know, that's part of what makes it ludicrous to extrapolate that, and I think it was done maliciously in a way, because of course the Jews didn't accept Christ as the Messiah. That was reasonable enough. You know, a lot of Jews did and followed Christ, and some Jews still worshipped in the temple until the destruction of the temple, but they were Messianic Jews. They were followers of Christ and Christians indeed, but they still went to the temple to worship and all. But anyone converted to Christ from among the Jews would still have that blood guilt if it had been called down on the whole nation and all. The apostles would have had the blood guilt as well because it was called down on the entire nation. Well, to think that the leaders of the Jews, some who were extremely corrupt, and many who had obtained their offices by bribery, to think that they could call down this curse on the entire nation is absolutely ludicrous.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's not the entire nation. Some would say, but it was the leadership of the time, which carries some weight.
The leadership of the time were guilty, but their children wouldn't even be guilty.
Can you say more about the leaders, maybe not the highest level as high priest, that you mentioned who disagreed, Nicodemus and the other one was Gamaliel, I think you said. Was it on the basis of the fair trial consideration, or were there other considerations?
Well, it was in the first place the high priest had no real authority to judge him on anything that could result in the death penalty. That's why they couldn't give a death penalty, so they had to take it to Pontius Pilate. But they had not convicted him on anything worthy of death penalty. I mean, they convicted him of blasphemy at one point, and I suppose he could have been stoned to death for that if they weren't under the Roman governance. But if you convict him of blasphemy, they ask him, "Are you then the Messiah?" And he said, "Thou sayest." And you're saying it, I'm not. So they convicted him of blasphemy and took him to Pontius Pilate. Said, "By our law, he should be put to death." And Pontius Pilate, of course, thinking, well, by your law, nobody can be put to death. The Romans have to decide these sort of things. So they put charges against him, and the Roman authorities might not have been too scrupulous. And very often the Roman authorities were very scrupulous, very careful about these things. But if there was a mass, they gathered quite a few people before Pilate and demanded that he be crucified, then Pilate could likely have yielded to that and done it just to quiet the crowd of the mob. But we don't know all the details, of course. We don't know what we don't have a transcript of the trial, so we don't know all the things that he was accused of what it was that finally triggered Pontius Pilate to crucify him, except that he says he's a king. His kingdom isn't of the world. Nevertheless, to talk about your kingdom or anybody else's kingdom except Caesar's might have been seen as sedition or treason. So that would have been a reasonable charge if he's talking about another kingdom. And Pilate wouldn't have understood or even cared exactly what he was referring to. It was a kingdom that was not Caesar's. Therefore, it was treason. So it's just not at all just or proper to place blood guilt on all Jews because of what a group of Jews did. That's it.
Some of the accuser are more vocal about the role of the Jews or the alleged role of the Jews in Jesus' death, would point out to subsequent positions, like in the Talmud, for example.
Yeah.
where there is allegedly a very demeaning way of dehumanizing way as well of talking about Jesus.
Yeah. Well, I mean, after the Jews naturally, who didn't, a lot of them did accept Christ, the ones who didn't would naturally not have thought of him as the Messiah, so they wouldn't have accepted Christianity. I mean, the Jews, and as far as Rome goes, the Jews were always a headache anyway. And in fact, they considered Christianity to be a sect of Jews for a period of time, and then realized that they were renounced by the Jews. Well, you can't say that there's some kind of blood guilt because the Jews followed the rabbis and didn't accept Christ as the Messiah. That doesn't place any blood guilt on them. And so, so that the whole idea is that, I mean, some of the Jews were opposed to Christians and actually caused some persecution against Christians, but that still doesn't make them guilty of the blood of Christ, have blood guilt. Because some Christians killed other Christians.
Right.
Because they didn't consider their teachings true. I mean, look at the trauma in Christianity, even after the First Ecumenical Council. The Arians didn't just dry up and blow away. You had Thessalians, you had all kinds of isms and things. There was a sort of a battleground in the Christian world over which Christians were, heretics. The Jews considered Christians to be heretic Jews, but the Christians had enough of their own heretics within the Christian movement by the 300s that the Ecumenical Council was called. So, and there were Christians who were willing to kill Christians because of theological differences. And that happened throughout the history of Christianity until the end of the Middle Ages, when civil law protected some Christians from other Christians. And it was civil law that brought the violence to an end, not any adherence to the religion itself. So
right.
You can't say, well, all Roman Catholics are guilty because are guilty of the auto de fe in Spain, the Inquisitions. All Catholics aren't guilty for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre.
Right.
Although some of that was sponsored by the leaders, the highest leaders of the Roman Catholic Church.
But
so the Pope doesn't speak for all the faithful in these things.
right. But here it seems that it's not just some religious leaders, but you have that in the sacred text, the Talmud, that reference to Jesus in a demeaning and
well, the Talmudic Christians, if they want to accept some kind of blood guilt, that's fine, but they accept it on themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Talmud's disturbing anyway. But there is a certain mystery here that needs to be studied in a perhaps not specifically religious way. It's why the Jews were so hated in so many places. But it needs to be a study that's not guided by an ideology or by theology. It needs to be a genuine, clean study about it, if there is. And that, you can't attribute guilt to every members of society or culture because what the leaders did. Everybody would be guilty, be bearing blood guilt for something. But you can't say these people are guilty of murdering God, all the Jews.
Right. But what should be the position of Christians and non-Christian on the way that Jesus is depicted in the Talmud, though.
Well, I mean, the even the Talmud doesn't speak for all Jews. But that was the opinion of the Jews and what they felt and thought about it, so they put it down in the Talmud. But I remember Metropolitan Anthony Shabovitsky liked the Torah, what he called the Torah Jews, the one who followed the Torah strictly, but perhaps didn't have much respect for the Talmudic Jews because they didn't think they were observing the Torah properly either.
Right.
Mm.
Right.
You find anti-Semitism among John Chrysostom and some of the other church fathers, but part of that is because the Jews were stirring up trouble for the Christians with the Roman authorities, and complaining. But so it's kind of a double-edged sword in that way. But there was never any excuse for the pogroms, including the great pogrom in Alexandria at the time of Cyril.
Were the pogroms done in on the basis of religious ideas, or
a lot of the pogroms, the great pogrom in Alexandria, were stirred up by the sermons of Cyril. I mean, he was. I remember. Now I think it was Callistus where we were at a conference somewhere, and he said, I don't know if he was quoting somebody or he'd written it himself. He said that Cyril of Alexandria was a great theologian, but a horrible person. So,
right,
and that might have summarized part of it.
Yeah.
We get these hatreds built up, a whole massive hatred within people, and they do very violent things. We see it now in the hate preaching in America, that sort of restoring this animosity between black people and white people that we thought we'd gotten past for a long time. And some of the speakers there, perhaps not many, but some of them, want to have said they'd like to reinstate the laws against biracial marriages, black people and white people getting married, because it diluted the white race. And so these hatreds build up and they're very intense, and people get killed with these things. Everybody in England was responsible for all the people that Queen Mary burned at stake, or were they all responsible for King Henry destroying the monasteries and abbeys in Britain? You can't say that because it was the leader of the people doing it, the whole nation was guilty of something. But there's some reason why this animosity toward Jews, how much of it is a direct result of Christian animosity, how much of it is a result of their own actions and activities, right. That remains to be seen. If somebody does a careful study of it, certainly the banking system had something to do with it. And so it needs a good, clean, academic, non-ideological study of it. That's all.
Thank you, Your Eminence.